In the bustling halls of the downtown courthouse, where justice was meant to be blind and fair, a story unfolded that would change not just one life, but an entire community's perspective. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors as people hurried about their business, none aware that this ordinary Tuesday would become extraordinary. Judge Richardson had presided over this court for 25 years. His reputation preceded him, stern, traditional, and known for his unwavering adherence to what he considered proper courtroom conduct. His salt-and-pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses had become as much a fixture of Courtroom 7 as the oak-paneled walls and the American flag standing proud in the corner. That morning, the judge's calendar included several routine cases, but one particular hearing would prove to be anything but routine. As he adjusted his black robes and settled into his high-backed leather chair, the bailiff called the next case. Through the double doors walked a tall figure in a navy blue blazer and pressed slacks, their shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. The defendant, who went by R.J., stood before the bench for a name change petition. Their voice, though quiet, carried a determination that filled the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm here today to request a legal name change that reflects who I truly am." Judge Richardson peered over his glasses, his expression hardening as he reviewed the paperwork before him. The corners of his mouth twitched downward, a telltale sign that many lawyers had learned to dread. "And why," he drawled, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain, "should I grant this unusual request?" The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers ceased as all eyes focused on the exchange unfolding before them. R.J. stood straighter, their hands clasped tightly in front of them to stop them from shaking. "Your Honor, this name change is essential for my identity and well-being. I've lived as my true self for the past 3 years, and—" "Living as your true self," the judge interrupted, making air quotes with his fingers. A few nervous titters echoed from the gallery, quickly silenced by the sharp rap of his gavel. "This court deals in facts, not feelings. Next, you'll tell me you identify as a different species entirely." R.J.'s attorney, a young public defender named Chen, jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client's request is legitimate and supported by medical documentation." "Counselor," Judge Richardson cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade, "I've seen all manner of requests pass through this courtroom, but this modern trend of denying basic biology is where I draw the line. This is a court of law, not a fantasy workshop." The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable striking R.J. like physical blows. Their face remained composed, but those closest could see their eyes glistening with unshed tears. The public defender's face flushed red with anger, but before she could speak again, an unexpected voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "Dad, stop." The single word echoed off the walls, and Judge Richardson's head snapped up, his face draining of color. Standing in the doorway was his youngest child, someone he hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. The figure who had once been his daughter now stood before the court in a crisp suit, their features a mirror of his own determination. "Taylor," he whispered, forgetting for a moment that his microphone was still on, broadcasting his shock to the entire courtroom. The younger Richardson strode forward, their footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. "I came here today because I heard you were presiding over this case. I couldn't stand by and watch you hurt someone else the way you hurt me." The judge's hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. The courtroom held its collective breath as father and child locked eyes across the space that had become both a physical and emotional chasm between them. 2 years ago, Taylor continued, their voice growing stronger with each word, "You told me that you couldn't understand or accept who I am. You said almost exactly the same things you just said to this person standing before you now. You chose your beliefs over your child, Dad. And now you're sitting up there, ready to deny someone else their dignity, their identity, their truth." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the usual creaks and shuffles of the old building seemed muted, as if the very walls were listening. Judge Richardson's face had lost its mask of authority, revealing the vulnerable human beneath the robes. The morning sun had shifted, and now it streamed directly through the high windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the air between father and child. In that moment, the judge seemed to age years, the weight of his actions visible in the slump of his shoulders and the trembling of his hands. RJ stood witnessing this family drama unfold, their own petition momentarily forgotten in the face of this raw, human moment. They saw in the judge's eyes something shifting, like ice breaking up on a frozen river, painful, dangerous, but necessary for the flow of life to continue. Several long moments passed before Judge Richardson found his voice again. When he spoke, it was barely above a whisper, but in the silent courtroom, everyone heard him clearly. I need to take a brief recess. His gavel fell softly, almost apologetically, on the sound block. As he rose to leave the bench, his eyes met Taylor's once more. In that glance passed 2 years of missed birthday calls, holiday dinners, and family photos. 2 years of stubbornness and pain, of words unsaid and love unexpressed. The judge disappeared into his chambers, leaving behind a courtroom full of people who had just witnessed not just a legal proceeding, but a profound human moment that would stay with them forever. The bailiff announced a 15-minute recess, but nobody moved. RJ remained at the podium, their attorney's hand now resting supportively on their shoulder. Taylor stood rooted to their spot, their breath coming in shallow gasps as the adrenaline of the moment began to fade. In the gallery, court reporters who had seen it all sat with their hands frozen over their stenography machines. Regular courthouse staff who had known Judge Richardson for years exchanged meaningful glances, their own perspectives shifting like kaleidoscope patterns in the morning light. This was just the beginning of a story that would ripple through the courthouse halls, through the city, and through the lives of everyone present. A story about justice, family, and the courage it takes to stand up for truth, even when that truth wears an unexpected face. Inside his chambers, Judge Richardson sat heavily in his leather chair, his judicial robe suddenly feeling like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. The morning's events played over and over in his mind like a film he couldn't stop, the hurt in RJ's eyes, the passionate defense from the young attorney, and most devastating of all, the unexpected appearance of Taylor. His hands trembled as he reached for the framed photograph on his desk, one he hadn't been able to put away despite everything. It showed a younger version of himself with Taylor at a father-daughter dance, both beaming at the camera. The memory of that night felt like it belonged to another lifetime, another person. He traced the edge of the frame with his finger, remembering how simple everything had seemed back then. A gentle knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, quickly wiping moisture from his eyes. His clerk, Mrs. Patel, entered with a concerned expression. She'd been with him for 15 years and had never seen him leave the bench like this. "Your Honor, there are still several cases on the docket, but I can have them rescheduled if you need." "No," he interrupted, his voice hoarse. "No, I need to finish this one. But first, could you bring Taylor in here? If they're willing." Mrs. Patel's face softened with understanding. "Of course, Your Honor." The minutes that followed felt like hours. Judge Richardson stood at his window, looking out over the city he'd served for so long. He'd always prided himself on upholding the law, on maintaining order and tradition. But now, those very principles seemed to be crumbling beneath his feet. The door opened again, and he heard familiar footsteps he would have recognized anywhere. He turned to face Taylor, really seeing them for the first time in 2 years. His child stood tall, confident despite the obvious tension in their shoulders. The same determined chin, the same intelligent eyes, how had he been so blind to the person his child had become? "Dad," Taylor said softly, and that one word carried the weight of 1,000 conversations they'd never had. "I don't know where to start," the judge admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent 2 years telling myself I was right, that I was protecting our family's values. But seeing you today, seeing that young person out there. I realized I've been protecting nothing while destroying everything. Taylor moved closer, their professional demeanor cracking slightly. Do you know why I became a transgender rights advocate, Dad? It wasn't just because of who I am. It was because of who you are, because you taught me to fight for justice, to stand up for what's right. I just never thought I'd have to fight you to do it. The judge sank back into his chair, the words hitting him like physical blows. I've been sitting on this bench for 25 years, he said, gesturing to the law books lining his walls. I thought I knew everything about justice. But today I realized I've been looking at it all wrong. It's not just about the law, Dad. It's about people. Real people with real lives and real pain. Taylor's voice cracked slightly. Like the pain I saw in RJ's eyes out there, the same pain I felt 2 years ago when you told me to leave and not come back until I came to my senses. The memory of that night hung heavy between them. The judge remembered the words he'd hurled like weapons, the door slamming, his wife's tears, and the deafening silence that had filled their home ever since. Your mother misses you, he said suddenly. She wanted to reach out so many times, but I stopped her. I thought it would encourage your phase. He spat the last word out with self-disgust. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Taylor moved to the window, standing beside their father. Their reflections overlapped in the glass, 2 generations of Richardsons, both struggling with truth and tradition in their own ways. Dad, that person out there in your courtroom? They're just like me. They're not asking for special treatment or trying to undermine society. They're just asking to be seen, to be acknowledged for who they really are. Just like I've been asking for these past 2 years. The judge stood up straighter, years of judicial training kicking in as he processed this new perspective. I need to make this right, he said firmly. Both with you and with RJ. But I don't know how. I've caused so much damage. Start by listening, Taylor suggested gently. That's all any of us have ever wanted, to be heard, to be understood. Not judged, not mocked, just heard. A knock at the door signaled that the recess was ending. Judge Richardson looked at his child, really looked at them, and saw not the person he'd tried to force them to be, but the person they'd become, strong, principled, compassionate. Will you stay? He asked, vulnerability clear in his voice. For the rest of the hearing? Taylor nodded, a small smile breaking through their serious expression. That's why I came today. Someone needs to witness this moment of justice being served properly. As they prepared to return to the courtroom, the judge paused with his hand on the door. Taylor. I can't change the past 2 years. But I promise you, from this moment forward, I'll do better. I'll be better. That's all any of us can do, Dad. Learn and grow. Together, they walked back into the courtroom, where RJ still waited with their attorney. The gallery had grown fuller during the recess, as word of the morning's events had spread through the courthouse. Every eye was on the judge as he resumed his seat, his bearing notably different from before. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. Where there had been tension and fear, now there was anticipation and hope. Judge Richardson cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and prepared to demonstrate that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but wisdom of the heart. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Richardson settled back into his chair. His posture was different now, less rigid, more human. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting gentle shadows across the room as he looked directly at RJ, seeing them properly for the first time. Before we proceed, the judge began, his voice carrying a new warmth that made several longtime court employees exchange surprised glances. I owe you an apology, RJ. My earlier comments were not only unprofessional but deeply hurtful. They reflected my own prejudices and fears, not the principles of justice this court is meant to uphold. RJ stood straighter at the podium, their eyes widening slightly at this unexpected turn. Their attorney, who had been preparing for another battle, slowly lowered her legal pad. "Your Honor," RJ responded, their voice steady despite the emotion visible on their face, "I appreciate your words. This isn't just about a name change for me. It's about being recognized for who I am, about having my identity acknowledged by the legal system I respect." The judge nodded, removing his glasses and setting them carefully on the bench. "Would you tell me your story, RJ? Not the legal arguments or the medical documentation, though those are important, but your personal journey. I promise you, this time, I'm listening." A murmur rippled through the gallery. In 25 years, no one had heard Judge Richardson invite personal testimony like this. Even the court reporter paused for a moment, ensuring her machine was working correctly. RJ took a deep breath, their hands relaxing their grip on the podium. "I've known who I am since I was young, but I didn't have the words for it then. I grew up in a small town where different meant difficult. I tried to be who everyone wanted me to be, finished school, got a good job teaching high school physics, lived what looked like a perfect life on paper. But it felt like wearing a costume every single day." The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. In the gallery, Taylor watched their father intently, recognizing the same look he'd worn during their conversation in chambers. 3 years ago, RJ continued, "one of my students came out as transgender. They were so brave, so honest about who they were, despite knowing they might face rejection. Watching them live their truth made me question why I couldn't do the same. They showed me that being different wasn't wrong, hiding who you are is what's wrong." Judge Richardson's hands clasped together tightly. "And your students, your colleagues, how did they respond when you began living authentically?" A small smile crossed RJ's face. "It was challenging at first. Change always is. But my students surprised me. They asked questions, yes, but with genuine curiosity, not judgment. One student told me that seeing me be true to myself gave them courage to be honest about their own struggles. My department head stood by me, made sure I had support. It wasn't perfect, but it was real." The young public defender, Chen, stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may add, RJ has become a mentor to many students, not just in physics but in courage. The letters of support from students, parents, and colleagues that we submitted with the petition speak to the positive impact they've had on the community." Judge Richardson picked up a thick folder from his bench, the letters he had earlier dismissed without reading. He opened it now, scanning the pages with growing interest. The courtroom remained hushed as he read, the only sound the gentle whir of the ceiling fans and the occasional shuffle of feet. "This letter," he said finally, holding up one page, "from a parent who writes that their child was failing science until they came to your class. They say you taught their child that it's okay to be different, that what matters is being honest and working hard." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "That you showed them that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply be ourselves." RJ nodded, blinking back tears. "That student is graduating this year. Top of their class in physics. They're heading to MIT in the fall." The judge set the letters down carefully, as if they were precious artifacts. He looked at Taylor, then back at RJ, his next words carrying the weight of both personal and professional authority. "You know, I've spent my career believing that the law is about maintaining order, about preserving what is traditional and proven. But sitting here today, listening to your story, reading these letters, I'm reminded that the highest purpose of law is to protect human dignity and enable human flourishing." He picked up RJ's petition, holding it with new respect. "This document isn't just about changing a name in a legal record. It's about recognizing your fundamental right to be who you are, to live authentically, to contribute to society as your true self." The afternoon light had softened, casting a warm glow across the courtroom as the judge continued. "Earlier today, I asked why I should grant this unusual request. Now I ask myself, what right do I have to deny it? What right does any of us have to deny another human being the dignity of their own identity? In the gallery, several people wiped tears from their eyes. The bailiff, a tough veteran of countless emotional courtroom scenes, cleared his throat gruffly. Taylor stood near the back, their hand pressed to their heart, watching their father become the man they had always known he could be. "RJ," the judge said, straightening in his chair, "I am prepared to rule on your petition. But before I do, is there anything else you'd like to say to this court?" RJ looked around the courtroom, at the faces of strangers who had witnessed this extraordinary afternoon, at their attorney who had fought so fiercely for them, at Taylor whose courage had sparked this transformation, and finally at the judge who had learned to see with new eyes. "Just thank you, Your Honor," they said softly. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Thank you for showing that it's never too late to change, to grow, to understand." The judge picked up his gavel, its weight feeling different in his hand now. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for his next words, knowing they were about to witness not just a legal decision, but a moment of profound human connection and understanding. Judge Richardson took a moment to compose himself, aware that his next words would carry weight far beyond the confines of this courtroom. The afternoon light painted long shadows across the floor, and the usual sounds of the courthouse seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "In the matter of the petition before this court," he began, his voice clear and measured, "I find not only that all legal requirements have been met, but that granting this petition serves the highest ideals of justice. A person's identity is fundamental to their dignity, their ability to participate fully in society, and their pursuit of happiness." He paused, looking directly at RJ. "Your petition for legal name change is hereby granted. Furthermore, I want to note for the record that your courage today has taught this court a valuable lesson about the true meaning of justice." The gavel fell with a gentle tap, so different from his usual forceful strike. The sound rippled through the courtroom, followed by a collective exhale from the spectators. RJ's attorney squeezed their client's shoulder, while RJ stood perfectly still, tears flowing freely down their face. But Judge Richardson wasn't finished. He removed his reading glasses and addressed the entire courtroom. "I'd like to share something with everyone present. In my years on this bench, I've presided over thousands of cases. I've made decisions that changed lives, sent people to prison, reunited families, and dispensed what I believed was justice. But today, I learned that justice without compassion is merely the enforcement of rules." He gestured toward Taylor, who still stood at the back of the courtroom. "My own child taught me this lesson first, 2 years ago, and I failed to learn it. I chose the comfort of my prejudices over the love of my child. I convinced myself I was protecting traditional values, when in reality, I was only protecting my own fear of change." The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted from tension to something almost sacred. Even the usual skeptics among the regular courthouse staff found themselves moved by the judge's unexpected candor. "RJ," he continued, "your students are fortunate to have a teacher who shows them that integrity means being true to oneself. You've taught this old judge the same lesson today. This court thanks you." As RJ gathered their paperwork with trembling hands, the judge turned to their attorney. "Ms. Chen, your passionate defense of your client reminds me of why I became a lawyer in the first place. To fight for justice, to stand up for those who need advocacy. Thank you for holding this court to its highest standards." The young attorney nodded, clearly moved by the acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor. This is why I became a lawyer." As the clerk began calling the next case, RJ turned to leave, but found their path blocked by well-wishers. Students who had cut class to support their teacher, colleagues who had taken their lunch break to attend the hearing, and even courthouse regulars who had been drawn in by the morning's drama all wanted to offer congratulations. In the midst of this impromptu celebration, Taylor approached the bench. Judge Richardson stepped down, removing his robes for the first time during a session. Father and child met in front of the bench, the physical barrier between them finally gone. "Dad," Taylor began, but the judge pulled them into a tight embrace, not caring about the tears that were now visible on his face. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "So sorry for all the time we've lost." RJ watched this reunion from near the courtroom doors, understanding that their personal journey had somehow catalyzed this healing moment between father and child. Their new papers clutched to their chest felt like more than just legal documents, they were a testament to the power of truth to transform lives. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like golden snow. The usual bustle of the courthouse continued outside, but in courtroom 7, time seemed to stand still as people witnessed the rare sight of justice and love working in perfect harmony. Mrs. Patel, the judge's clerk, approached him quietly. "Your Honor, there are still several cases on the docket." The judge straightened up, keeping one arm around Taylor. "Yes, of course." He turned to his child. "Will you stay? Maybe we could have dinner after. Your mother, she'd love to see you." Taylor's smile was answer enough. As they took a seat in the gallery, the judge returned to the bench, but something had fundamentally changed. The formal judicial mask he'd worn for 25 years had cracked, revealing the humanity beneath. As RJ finally made their way out of the courtroom, they paused in the doorway, looking back at the scene, the judge adjusting his robes, Taylor watching proudly from the gallery, Ms. Chen preparing for her next case, and the afternoon sun illuminating it all. They realized that their quest for legal recognition had become something larger, a catalyst for healing, understanding, and change. Outside in the courthouse corridor, a young student who had been in the gallery approached RJ. "Thanks for being you, Teach," they said simply. "You showed us all something important today." RJ smiled, clutching their new papers. Sometimes the best lessons happen outside the classroom. The sounds of the courthouse returned to normal, the shuffle of papers, the murmur of conversations, the click of heels on marble floors. But for everyone who had been in courtroom 7 that afternoon, something had shifted. They had witnessed not just a legal proceeding, but a reminder that the law, at its best, serves to recognize and protect the dignity of every human being. As RJ walked toward the courthouse steps, they felt lighter, as if a weight they'd carried for years had finally been lifted. The late afternoon sun welcomed them into their new life, their true identity now recognized not just in their heart, but in the eyes of the law. Behind them, in courtroom 7, Judge Richardson continued his docket, changed forever by the courage of two individuals who had taught him that sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply to see, acknowledge, and embrace the truth of who people really are. The news of what happened in courtroom 7 spread through the city like ripples in a pond. By evening, the local legal community was buzzing with discussion about Judge Richardson's transformation. The courthouse security guards, who had witnessed countless dramas unfold within these walls, shared the story during their shift changes, each retelling adding new layers of meaning to the day's events. At home that evening, Judge Richardson stood in his kitchen, watching his wife prepare dinner with trembling hands. He had called her right after court, telling her Taylor was coming home. Now, the sounds of cooking and the familiar scent of her signature lasagna filled the house, but the atmosphere was charged with nervous energy. "Do you think they'll like the dinner?" she asked, checking the oven for the 4th time. "Maybe I should have made something else." Taylor's dietary preferences might have changed. "I don't even know if." The judge gently took her hands in his, stopping their nervous flutter. "They're coming home, Patricia. That's what matters." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Tell me again what happened today. I want to understand everything." As he recounted the day's events, his wife listened intently, occasionally wiping her eyes with her apron. When he described the moment Taylor walked into the courtroom, she had to sit down, overwhelmed by emotion. 2 years, she whispered. "We lost 2 years with our child because of our fear and ignorance." The doorbell rang, causing them both to jump. Through the frosted glass, they could see Taylor's silhouette, and beside them, another figure, RJ, whom Taylor had invited on the judge's behalf. Opening the door felt like opening a new chapter in their lives. Taylor stood there, looking both familiar and new, holding a bottle of wine. RJ stood slightly behind them, clutching a homemade apple pie, their nervous smile matching Patricia's. "Mom," Taylor said softly, and Patricia pulled them into a fierce embrace, years of separation dissolving in tears and whispered apologies. The dinner that followed was unlike anything the Richardson household had seen before. The formal dining room, usually reserved for holidays and special occasions, became a space for healing and understanding. The judge had removed his tie, Patricia had forgotten to worry about her perfectly pressed tablecloth, and conversation flowed as naturally as the wine. RJ shared stories about their teaching experiences, about the students who had supported them, and about their own family's journey to acceptance. Patricia listened intently, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Taylor's hand, as if reassuring herself that her child was really there. "You know," the judge said, setting down his wine glass, "I've been thinking about how many other families might be going through what we did. How many other parents are letting fear rob them of precious time with their children." Taylor nodded, understanding where their father was heading. The legal system can be intimidating for transgender individuals seeking recognition. Many don't have the resources or support to navigate it. "That's why I've made a decision," the judge continued, sitting up straighter. "I'm going to start a program at the courthouse, educational sessions for judges and court staff about gender identity and the importance of treating everyone with dignity in our legal system." RJ's eyes widened. "That could make a real difference, Your Honor." "Please, call me Robert," the judge insisted. "We're not in court now. And I was hoping, would you consider being one of our speakers? Your perspective as an educator could be invaluable." Before RJ could respond, Patricia jumped in. "And we could host support group meetings here, for parents who are struggling to understand and accept their children. I know I could have used that kind of support 2 years ago." Taylor looked around the table, taking in these people who had become an unexpected family of sorts. "You know what this means, right? You're becoming activists." The judge chuckled, a sound that had been absent from this house for too long. "I prefer to think of it as finally doing my job properly, ensuring justice and dignity for all." As the evening progressed, more plans were made. Patricia talked about organizing PFLAG meetings in their community. The judge discussed reaching out to other courts to share what he had learned. RJ offered to connect them with LGBTQ+ youth organizations that could use legal support and mentorship. In the kitchen, as they cleaned up together, Taylor watched their parents working side by side, noting how their father dried each dish Patricia washed, just as he had done throughout their childhood. Some things hadn't changed, even as everything had transformed. "You know," Patricia said, handing a plate to her husband, "I kept your room exactly as you left it. I couldn't bear to change anything. But maybe it's time to update it together? Make it reflect who you are now." Taylor's breath caught, understanding the deeper meaning in their mother's words. "I'd like that, Mom." The judge cleared his throat. "And maybe we could look into making some changes at the courthouse too. The signage, the forms, the procedures, make everything more inclusive and respectful." RJ, who had been helping to pack leftovers, smiled. "Small changes can make a big difference. My students taught me that." As the evening drew to a close, they gathered in the living room, where family photos chronicled the years. The judge noticed how many gaps there were, 2 years of memories missing, moments they could never get back. But instead of dwelling on the loss, he found himself looking forward to the new memories they would create. "We should take a picture," Patricia suggested suddenly, pulling out her phone. "Our first family dinner in 2 years deserves to be documented." They clustered together, RJ initially hanging back until the judge insisted they join. As Patricia set the timer and hurried to join them, the judge looked at these faces, his wife's joy, Taylor's quiet confidence, RJ's grateful smile, and felt a profound sense of rightness. The camera flashed, capturing not just 4 people in a living room, but the beginning of something larger than themselves. A movement that started in Courtroom 7 was spreading, touching lives they hadn't even met yet, creating ripples of change that would continue long after this evening ended. As RJ prepared to leave, the judge walked them to the door. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being part of this journey." RJ nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "Sometimes the hardest cases teach us the most important lessons, right, Your Honor?" "Robert," he reminded them with a smile. "And yes, they do. They certainly do." 1 month after the landmark day in Courtroom 7, the changes that had begun in that moment of revelation continued to ripple outward. The courthouse had taken on a different atmosphere, subtle but significant, like a shift in the weather that everyone could feel but few could name. Judge Richardson sat in his office early one morning, reviewing his docket for the day. His desk, once dominated by law books and case files, now held something new, a small rainbow flag in a silver stand, a gift from Taylor. Beside it sat a growing stack of letters from people who had heard about what happened in his courtroom. A knock at the door interrupted his reading. "Come in," he called, looking up to see Mrs. Patel entering with her usual morning coffee and an unusually bright smile. "Your Honor, the first session of the diversity training program starts in an hour. The conference room is already filling up." She paused, then added, "There's a waiting list for the next session." The judge nodded, adjusting his tie as he stood. What had started as a small initiative had grown beyond their expectations. Judges from neighboring districts had asked to participate, and the state Supreme Court had expressed interest in implementing similar programs statewide. In the conference room, RJ was setting up their presentation materials, looking more confident than they had that day in court. They had taken a leave of absence from teaching to help develop the training program, their experience in education proving invaluable in crafting the curriculum. "Good morning, Robert," RJ greeted him warmly. Their use of his first name still felt new, but right. "Ready to make some more history?" The room filled quickly with judges, clerks, bailiffs, and court administrators. The judge recognized faces from every department, people who had worked alongside him for years but whom he was only now beginning to truly know as individuals. As RJ began their presentation, the judge watched his colleagues' reactions. Some nodded in understanding, others frowned in concentration, and a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He recognized those expressions, he had worn them himself not so long ago. "Language matters," RJ was saying, their teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. "The words we choose in our courtrooms can either affirm or deny someone's dignity. When we make the effort to use correct pronouns, preferred names, and inclusive language, we're not just being polite, we're upholding the fundamental principle of human dignity that our legal system is meant to protect." In the back of the room, Taylor sat taking notes. They had taken on the role of program coordinator, using their advocacy experience to build bridges between the legal system and the LGBTQ+ community. The judge caught their eye, and they shared a smile. During the lunch break, small groups formed naturally, discussing what they'd learned. The judge overheard one of his more conservative colleagues, Judge Thompson, speaking with RJ. "I've been on the bench for 30 years, Thompson was saying, his voice thoughtful. "Never occurred to me that something as simple as updating our forms could make such a difference. My own grandson, well, he's been trying to tell me something, I think. Maybe it's time I really listened." Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, Patricia had set up an information table for the new family support group. What had started as a small gathering in their living room had grown into a weekly meeting attended by dozens of families. Today, she was organizing their first public workshop. "We're calling it Opening Hearts, Opening Minds," she explained to a curious court reporter. "Because that's what this journey is about, opening ourselves to understanding and love." The judge stepped out to join her for lunch, something he had rarely done before. As they sat on a courthouse bench sharing sandwiches, Patricia showed him the latest family photo on her phone, a picture from last weekend's barbecue, where Taylor had brought their partner to meet the family for the first time. "Remember how worried we were about what the neighbors would think?" Patricia mused, shaking her head at their former selves. "Now look at us, hosting PFLAG meetings in our living room." The judge squeezed her hand. "We were so focused on maintaining appearances that we forgot to maintain what really mattered, our relationship with our child." After lunch, the training resumed with a panel discussion. Community members shared their experiences with the legal system, the barriers they'd faced, the discrimination they'd encountered, and their hopes for change. The judge noticed how his colleagues leaned forward, really listening, many of them taking notes. One young person's story particularly struck him. They described going to court for a name change, much like RJ had, but encountering a judge who dismissed their petition without even looking at them. "I felt invisible," they said, their voice steady despite the pain in their words. "Like I didn't deserve to exist in the eyes of the law." The judge stood up then, not as a speaker but as a participant. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "Not just for my own past actions, but as a representative of a system that has often failed to see and respect you. We can do better. We must do better." The afternoon session focused on practical changes, updating court forms to include gender-neutral options, implementing training for court staff on respectful communication, establishing protocols for handling name and gender marker changes with dignity and efficiency. As the day drew to a close, the judge returned to his chambers to find an email from the State Bar Association. They wanted him to speak at their annual conference about the transformation happening in his courthouse. The subject line read, "Creating a more just justice system." He was drafting his response when Taylor knocked on his door. They had started having weekly dinners together, rebuilding their relationship one conversation at a time. "Ready to go, Dad? Mom's trying out a new recipe tonight." The judge smiled, saving his draft and reaching for his coat. As they walked through the courthouse together, they passed the newly installed gender-neutral restroom signs, another small but significant change. "You know," Taylor said as they reached the parking lot, "when I walked into your courtroom that day, I never imagined all of this would happen." The judge paused, looking back at the building where he had worked for so many years. The setting sun painted the granite facade in warm hues, making it look softer somehow, more welcoming. "Sometimes," he replied, "justice needs a wake-up call. I'm just grateful I was finally ready to answer it." As they drove home, the judge reflected on how much had changed in just 1 month. The courthouse was transforming, not just in policy but in spirit. His family was healing. And across the city, other families were finding hope and understanding through the programs they had started. RJ's words from the training session echoed in his mind, "Change happens one heart at a time, one decision at a time, one moment of courage at a time." The story that had begun in Courtroom 7 was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning to unfold in ways none of them could have predicted. 1 year had passed since that transformative day in Courtroom 7. The courthouse steps were adorned with flowers and rainbow ribbons, celebrating the first anniversary of what had become known as the Hearts of Justice initiative. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps where a small crowd had gathered for the commemoration ceremony. Judge Richardson stood at the podium, his judicial robes replaced by a well-fitted suit with a rainbow pin on the lapel, a Father's Day gift from Taylor. The past year had aged him in some ways and rejuvenated him in others, each silver hair earned through months of growth and change. 1 year ago, he began, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza, "I thought I knew everything about justice. I had spent decades interpreting laws, issuing rulings, and believing that was enough. But true justice, I learned, begins with seeing the humanity in every person who walks through these doors." In the front row, RJ sat beside their students. They had returned to teaching physics but continued to lead training sessions at the courthouse twice a month. Their presence had become a familiar sight in the halls of justice, where they helped guide other transgender individuals through the legal process with dignity and support. The changes we've implemented here might seem small to some, the judge continued. Gender-neutral language on our forms. Comprehensive training for court staff. A support system for families. But I've learned that small changes can transform lives in big ways. He gestured to a large poster behind him, displaying statistics from the past year: over 500 court employees trained in inclusive practices, more than 200 families supported through the peer counseling program, and dozens of other courthouses across the state adopting similar initiatives. Patricia, sitting beside Taylor and their partner, wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the countless evening meetings in their living room, the late-night phone calls from struggling parents, the gradual building of a community that had become like extended family. But numbers don't tell the whole story, the judge said, his voice softening. The real measure of our progress lies in the stories I hear every day. The young person who felt seen for the first time in a courtroom. The parent who found the courage to embrace their child's truth. The colleague who learned to question their own biases and grow beyond them. In the audience, Judge Thompson sat with his grandson, their hands clasped together in a picture of reconciliation that had seemed impossible a year ago. Other familiar faces dotted the crowd: courthouse staff, community members, families who had found hope and healing through the programs they had built together. I stand before you today not just as a judge, but as a father who almost lost the most precious gift in life, the love of my child. His voice cracked slightly, and Taylor smiled encouragingly from their seat. My journey of understanding began with a moment of crisis, but it has led to a lifetime of growth. RJ stood next, approaching the podium with the confidence of someone who had found their place in the world. When I walked into courtroom 7 that day, I was fighting for my own identity. I never imagined I would become part of a movement that would help so many others claim theirs. They shared stories of the support group they had started for LGBTQ+ educators, of students who had found the courage to live authentically, of families who had chosen love over fear. The crowd listened intently, many nodding in recognition of their own journeys reflected in these words. The ceremony continued with the unveiling of a new installation in the courthouse lobby, a wall of photographs and stories celebrating the diversity of the community they served. Among them was the photo taken at the Richardsons' dinner table 1 year ago, now a symbol of how love could bridge any divide. After the formal ceremony, people lingered in the plaza, sharing stories and embracing. The judge found himself in conversation with a young clerk who had recently come out to their family. Your story gave them hope, the clerk said quietly. They saw how you changed, and it helped them believe they could too. Inside the courthouse, Patricia had organized a reception in the main hall. The space that had once felt formal and intimidating now hummed with warmth and conversation. Children of different families played together while their parents chatted, the barriers of difference long forgotten in the simple joy of community. Taylor, who had become a respected advocate for LGBTQ+ rights in the legal system, was discussing plans for the coming year with a group of legal professionals. Their voice carried the same passion that had filled courtroom 7 a year ago, but now tempered with experience and hope. We're not just changing policies, they were saying. We're changing the culture of justice itself. As the afternoon drew to a close, the judge found himself back in courtroom 7. The room was empty now, the late sun streaming through the windows just as it had that fateful day. He sat in his chair, running his hand along the smooth wood of the bench. RJ appeared in the doorway, followed by Taylor and Patricia. They had developed a habit of ending significant days here, in the space where everything had changed. Thinking deep thoughts, Dad? Taylor asked, settling into the gallery. The judge smiled, looking at these people who had become more than family. They had become partners in a journey of transformation that had touched countless lives. I was just remembering how afraid I was of change, he admitted. How I thought my role was to preserve tradition at any cost. Now I understand that the greatest legal tradition we can uphold is the recognition of human dignity in all its forms. Patricia reached for his hand across the bench. And in preserving that, we found something even more precious, our own humanity. As they prepared to leave, RJ paused at the podium where they had stood a year ago. You know, my students ask me sometimes if I'm still scared when I tell my story. I tell them that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about believing that love is worth the risk. The judge looked around the courtroom one last time before turning out the lights. The space held so many stories now, stories of courage, of change, of justice tempered with compassion. But more importantly, it held the promise of stories yet to come, of lives yet to be transformed by the simple power of seeing, hearing, and embracing the truth of who people really are. As they walked out together, their footsteps echoing in the marble halls, the judge reflected that perhaps this was the truest form of justice, not blind and cold, but clear-sighted and warm, recognizing the dignity in every human heart. The story that had begun in crisis had become a testament to the endless possibility of change, the enduring power of love, and the profound truth that justice, at its core, is simply another word for respect.